Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, where we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe. I'm your host, Nia Thomas. Join me as we talk to today's guest.
Today, we're joined by Dr. Jim Salvucci, who is the President and CEO of Guidance for Greatness. With over 30 years in higher education and the corporate sector, Jim specialises in helping leaders clarify their mission, tap into their inner wisdom, and take precise action. His leadership coaching enables clients to lead with more conviction and less effort. Jim's journey began as a professor and college administrator, mentoring hundreds and improving educational qualities and effectiveness. He then transitioned to the corporate world, where he continues to help leaders align their vision, values, and actions with their organizational missions and culture. Jim, it's brilliant to have you here. So tell us about this 30-year career.
Yeah, Nia, thank you for having me on the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast. It's wonderful to be here. I've been following you for a while. And so I think we have a little mutual admiration going in terms of
Absolutely. We certainly do.
30 years in higher education, 30 years at universities and colleges in the US. I've always been a leader. So I'll talk about it from a leadership perspective. I mean, when I was a kid, I was a leader. I was in Boy Scouts. I was thrust into leadership positions way before my time. I really messed up. But I learned a lot. I was a boss at age 18. I had employees. Can't say I was a great leader, but I wasn't bad. I did that throughout my life. Eventually, I got into higher ed, became an English professor, and worked at a number of different schools. I got a doctorate at University of Toronto, and I got a job outside of the city of Baltimore at a small university, and I decided to really get into faculty leadership. And so as part of our faculty governance system, led that a couple of times. I helped us get reaccredited. We have different reaccrediting bodies, regional reaccrediting bodies within the United States. And I led that charge, did quite a few things as a faculty leader. And then one day I was asked to become a dean.
Wow.
I was asked to become the dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences.
Amazing.
Which is great, except for one thing. There was no School of Humanities and Social Sciences.
Oh, okay.
So I was the founding dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, which is a little bit different. I realized that putting together a school is easy. It's nuts and bolts. This goes with that goes with this, no big deal. What's hard is getting it up and running and keeping it running. That requires leadership. So I also realized that my whole life, although I've been a leader, and not a bad one, pretty effective, I was what I call a gut leader, right? I led from my intuition, from my instincts. I didn't really understand leadership. I didn't think about it. I didn't study it. And I realized I needed to up my leadership game. And a typical way of doing that is to find a mentor, find someone or a model, and you turn to your bosses first. Well, my boss was not a leader. He was a boss, and I make a strict distinction. His boss, the president of the institution, was definitely not a leader. And I was like, okay, well, I'm out of luck there. So I looked at my peers. They were kind of flailing around. I imitated them for a while. That didn't work out so well. Found myself micromanaging and, becoming a perfectionist and a workaholic, all the things I always decried. So I pulled back and I realized that I needed to start learning how to lead, and I need to treat leadership as a discipline. My first discipline was English. My second discipline became leadership. I studied it, started reading about it, going to conferences, going to training, speaking on it, writing on it, and applying what I learned. Made a lot of mistakes, learned from my mistakes. I also learned that you can learn from other people's mistakes. I call that learning from the negative paradigm, right? Don't ever ignore the bad stuff you see, the systemic stuff, people's behaviors. You look at that and say, well, how can I do it differently? I don't like that. I don't like how my boss is treating me. How could I do it differently? It's not usually the opposite, right? It isn't just do the opposite. It's usually something a little more subtle than that. Did that for a while, quite a few years, and then got a position at another university as a vice president. I was the provost, chief academic officer, second to the president, and had a wonderful president, really fantastic, the best leader I ever worked for by magnitudes. He was there for that 1 year, that my first year, and then he retired and brought in somebody else. Next thing you know, everybody's gone. Moved on to another school, and had a not so great experience as a vice president and decided to leave higher ed altogether. Mm-hmm. And that was around 2020. So it was around the time of the COVID lockdowns and whatnot, and realized I was applying for jobs and realized this was not for me anymore. I just did not like what was going on in higher education. And I realized the kind of leadership I was presenting was not welcome. So I thought about, well, what did I do as an administrator that I really loved? And I love being an administrator. What did I do? Well, the one thing I really, really loved was working with young people and helping them become great leaders. So that's what I decided to do. And that's how I found it, Guidance for Greatness. That's what I do.
Amazing. And it's interesting, as you say, this idea of positive role models or positive descriptions and the negative. And that's definitely something that I talk about through my research, is that people will often describe things as what they want them to be and what they don't want them to be. And it gives you a really helpful frame of reference in terms of, these are the boundaries within which I work. So you'll never have the definitive explanation or the manual that tells you everything, but it gives you that helpful framework of, I don't want to go beyond these boundaries. I don't want to become what I don't appreciate or what I don't like in the world of leadership. And these are the things that I do want to emulate. And I think that's interesting, that people often explain what they want and what they don't want as a way of describing.
Yep.
You say that the only way to rid the world of bad bosses is to master the skills of great leadership. Tell us what bad bosses are and tell us how we get rid of them.
Yeah. So first off, the phrase bad bosses is somewhat redundant. The technical term, I'm an English professor, the technical term is, it's a semantic pleonasm, where it's just like this double meaning. It's like saying tiny little. Okay. Yes, all bosses are bad. It's my formulation, because bosses are not leaders. Very few bosses lead at all, and even fewer are great leaders. Lots of leaders, even great leaders, will never be a boss. Those two terms have nothing to do with each other. So I make a distinction between bosses, which is just a title, really, and leaders. A really great manager is going to probably be a leader. Someone who's a director, has a position of that sort, is going to be a great leader. Bosses just don't hold up this stuff. Our world is rife with bad bossing. And we even aggrandize it. We say things like, oh, he tied his shoes like a boss or whatever, these silly phrases, so he bullied his shoes. What does that mean? This doesn't mean anything to me, because being a boss is not a positive thing. And when you see it that way, you realize that what we have to do is we have to get people who are in management positions, who have titled positions, who are in these leadership positions, to step it up and actually be the leaders. One of the reasons I push that idea of the negative paradigm is because so many people get into a management position. They haven't been trained. The models they have are very poor. Yeah. And they tend to default to the models, even though they don't like what their own bosses have done. And they too become a boss. Bosses beget bosses, leaders beget leaders. So it behooves anyone moving into that position to sort of step back and figure out how to do it differently. And there's lots of resources. I'm one, you're one, right? There's lots of ways of figuring this out. But the trick is, don't replicate what you don't like.
Absolutely. I talk a lot about experiential learning. And you're right, if you're seeing a leadership style or a boss style that you don't want to emulate, get yourself some experience and find a coach, find a mentor, find some training to give you that experience and give you a different perspective.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the role of self-awareness in creating good leaders? Because obviously this podcast, what we're very interested in is self-awareness and self-aware leadership. Where do you think it fits?
Yeah. So, that knowing self business is critical. You have to know who you are. You have to know what your values are. You have to know how you behave, which is in many ways more important than values. Doesn't it matter ultimately what your values are? You could be a bad person inside. If you act great on the outside, who cares? I've never seen that personally, but we usually see the opposite, right? People are like, oh, I'm a good person on the inside. Whereas on the outside, their behavior is very poor. You need to be aware of your behavior, how you come across to other people. And the first thing you need to do is you need to lead yourself. You often hear people say that. You start with leading yourself. And what that means is becoming self-aware. It's exactly what that means. Becoming the type of person who knows where they come from, what their values are, how they're challenged, what their weaknesses are, and constantly wanting to improve. It's a constant leadership, like anything good in the world, requires constant maintenance, constant attention, and you need to get better at it. It's about learning.
I like that idea of maintenance. So I talk about a superhighway because it's an endless journey. And sometimes you need to pull off to the side of the road and give your vehicle a bit of maintenance. So maybe that's that self-awareness vehicle that you need to make sure it propels you along. So I first came across Jim, and listeners and watchers, you won't know this, but I first came across Jim through what he writes on Substack, and it's great. If you're a fan of Substack and you're a fan of reading newsletters, I definitely suggest you go and head over, and I'll make sure that there's a link in the show notes. Something that you wrote recently in one of your articles, Jim, was about being transparent, not invisible. Talk to us about that, because I thought that was really imaginative and really descriptive, the way you brought those two things together.
Yeah, thanks. So I came up with that idea, that phrasing, when I was a faculty leader way back when. I was in charge. It was a 1-year term for election for our faculty governance system. We had a faculty council. And this faculty council was particularly weak. It was relatively new. It was designed to be weak. We didn't have much say in anything. I was one of the original members, and I was not liking the path it was going down. We met in a conference room, and there were like 14 of us crammed into this conference room. We're supposed to be open to the public. God forbid a guest showed up. They just got sort of stared down until they left. Not very welcoming. We met at a time when no one was on campus because there were no classes then, that kind of thing. It's really inhospitable. And so we were completely invisible, and nobody knew what we did. We'd only existed a few years. We'd been doing some very positive things, but really nobody knew about it. So I started thinking about the idea of, what if we made ourselves much more public? We actually put ourselves in we met in a space that was welcoming. We designed it so it would be welcoming, and we're much more visible. And I realized at the same time that by doing that, that would force us to be much more transparent. And it's a little bit of a paradox. In the physical world, that's not possible, right? The more visible you are, you can't be transparent and more visible.
Absolutely.
But in the world of leadership, that's most certainly the way you want to be. You're exposing yourself. Transparency is about exposing yourself, being vulnerable, being open. I talk about radical transparency, the idea where you just put yourself out there, warts and all, and have people help you cope with it. Tell them what your weakness. I used to do as a teacher. I'd come into a class and say, I don't really know this thing. Let's talk about it, So the students knew where I was coming from. It was just a very open way of being. Well, that's a form of visibility, not invisibility. And that's where that idea comes from. What I did was I opened up, just in terms of this faculty council, we started meeting in a very public room in the middle of campus, big room, and I set up tables so that they were V-shaped, and the audience would sit in the open legs of the V, and the council would sit on either side of the table, because the council was a deliberative body, and we needed to see each other to be able to talk. And then we set up chairs for an audience. Then I started serving food. That really got people there. First, I did that out of pocket, and then eventually I begged a little budget off the administration. And eventually they moved it. The administration actually set up a time where classes didn't meet, no clubs met, nothing. And once a month, the only thing that happened was faculty council. That was years after I'd stopped being the chair. And boom, all of a sudden, many more people were there. But it just transformed the culture of the council. It became much more relevant, much more important. People understood what it did, why it did what it was doing. It couldn't escape. It couldn't hide. It was just a wonderful thing all around.
Greater transparency gives you greater visibility. You're absolutely right. That paradox. I'm reminded of a chief executive in an organization that I've long since left, and he was known as the Invisible Man. And absolutely, we had no idea what went on in the secret offices of the C-suite. He was invisible. He was not transparent. And in terms of describing exactly the opposite of what we want, that was it. So yes, let's not be invisible leaders. So tell me, how can we be top class gaslighters?
So you're definitely referencing one of my particular articles. I wrote it a couple years ago on April Fool's Day, which is my favorite day of the year. And then I think I'm just going to run it as an annual thing every April Fool's.
Yeah.
It was called How to Be a Gaslighter, or no, I'm sorry. So You Want to Be a Gaslighter. That's what it was. I've long been really interested in this concept of gaslighting in the workplace. Part of it comes from a long piece I wrote on bullying in the workplace, or just bullying in general, called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Bullies. And very satirical piece. I used to teach satire. Sorry, it's the way my brain is wired. And so the gaslighting piece is kind of in the same spirit. So I write it from the point of view of someone who has been gaslit his whole life and now has decided to join the other side and is, putting his observations out there so other people would be excellent gaslighters. And it talks about the history of the term and whatnot. But and so I make a distinction between, there's 3 modes of deception, really. There's lying, there's bullshitting, and then there's gaslighting. And they have similarities and they have differences. Liars are always very aware of the truth. There's a philosopher named Henry Frankfurter who wrote a book called On Bullshit, and he talks about lying and bullshit and the difference between the two. It's actually, I used to give it to my students to read for classes, for like rhetoric classes and things like that. And they'd always be upset because they thought it was a joke and it was a very serious philosophical text. And so liars are always hyper aware of the truth. They just try to subvert it. They try to do the opposite of the truth. Bullshitters, on the other hand, could care less about the truth. Sometimes they use the truth to their advantage. And then gaslighters are very similar to bullshitters, but the difference is the gaslighting is like long-term, and it involves lying, it involves bullshitting, but it's a much longer, more in-depth project. Bullshitting could be, a one-off. It could just be something somebody says. It's sort of a tactic. Gaslighting is more like a strategy, right? You want to get something done. So what I suggest, if you want to be a good gaslighter, is first off, you find a cause, like a long-term cause, and then find a target. Sometimes the target and the cause are very closely related. You might just want to gaslight a particular person, and you find a cause after you find the target. Doesn't matter the order, but you do them in together. Then you might want to try a little bullshit. Just try it out with them. Just kind of see if you can fool them. And if that works, great. Now you're on your way. You can keep going. And then you also want to decide if you want to get other people involved. If you do, you never discuss the conspiracy openly. You just kind of, keep it under wraps. And then finally, what you do is you just go in and you make someone feel insane. You make them lose their mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you make them feel like this cognitive dissonance. And the term actually originates from, there was a play and then a couple movies called Gaslight. And the basic plot was a man marries this woman and he wants to get at some jewels that are hidden in the attic of her house that she inherited. And he marries her in order to get to the jewels. This is not a very satisfying plot line, by the way. And so what he does is he plays with the gaslight to like he flickers it up and down. This is before there were electric lights. Flickers it up and down to make her think, and he denies that it's flickering to make her think she's going insane. So that when he's rummaging in the upstairs, she doesn't, he tells her, oh, there was no noise upstairs. Yeah. So from a plot point of view, it's a terrible plot. But the idea is she starts to feel like she's losing her mind. She can't trust her own judgments. And he's fooling her the whole time, all to get his hands on these jewels that are somehow hidden in the attic.
That's frightening. And I had an experience of being gaslit, and it took me 6 months to realize that was the definition of behavior. And I think you're absolutely right. It makes you question your sanity, your competence, your capability. And I was lucky I had the opportunity of somebody tapping me on the shoulder and taking me away and saying, I need to tell you about this individual because it happened to me. And they were a very senior person, and it was really a light bulb as opposed to a gaslight. And absolutely, gaslighting is that strategy that you describe, and it is long-term and it's subtle and it's very dangerous.
Oh, yeah. And gaslighting in the workplace is a disaster. It's a form of bullying. It's one of the techniques that bullies use. There's several, but that's a big one. You're lucky that someone helped you out of it. And that's how it usually is. Somebody else has to show you the light because you're caught up in it.
Yeah.
If you can see it, my last position, one of the reasons I left higher ed, my last position was the president of the institution was a gaslighter. She was gaslighting me. And one day she did this thing and I just thought, my God, she's gaslighting me.
Right.
I was her number 2 and she was just like making up this thing and I started resisting and she did not like that. One thing about bullies is you cannot really fight a bully who is your boss. I know how to fight bullies. You can't fight a bully who has the power. You can't fight a bully who's a teacher. You can't fight a bully who's like a police officer. Anybody who has the power, sort of an absolute power over you, you can't fight. But it's the same thing with gaslighting. It's a very dangerous thing to fight them. I did fight her, and it didn't go well. Let's just say that.
It's really tough, isn't it, when you're having that challenge upwards. But if there's anybody listening or watching and they think that maybe they're being gaslit, please talk to somebody, because it doesn't matter what level of seniority you are. It can happen to anybody at any time because it is so subtle. You may not notice it until you are so far down the line that you really do think it's you. So please reach out to your mentors, your confidants within your workplace, and please talk about it because it is so damaging and it's so important that we do our utmost to prevent this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something else that I read of yours was about the Picard Yoda Leadership Continuum. So tell us, Jim, where are you on that continuum?
Oh, clearly I'm on the Picard end of the continuum. Okay. So yeah, this is the Star Trek versus Star Wars. This came from, there's a columnist in the New York Times who really fabulous columnist writes on tech named Kara Swisher. And she just had this little digression about, Star Wars is sort of about bang, bang, shoot 'em up, good versus evil. And Star Trek, she said it's like an intergalactic Benetton commercial. But everybody's it's sort of egalitarian and everybody's trying to get along. And they're always trying to convince the bad guys not to be bad guys anymore. They're just trying to kill them. And I was thinking about that and I realized that, yeah, they're actually two very different views of the world and two very different leadership styles. And probably the most important positive leader in the Star Wars universe is Yoda, right? He's considered the great teacher and everybody wants to be like Yoda. Yoda's a jerk. He's a lousy teacher.
Oh, wow. Okay. Is he?
He's very rude. He's very self-centered. He's very, individualistic. He doesn't really care about anybody else. He's just worried about himself. That's very true of pretty much all the Jedi. In fact, I noticed when the Jedi get together, they band together, they tend to all die. When they work in small groups or by themselves, that's when they succeed. This is not leadership. These are not good examples of leadership. And everything in that world is black and white, up and down, hot or cold. You're either on the dark side or you're on whatever the other side's called, right? And so it's not a realistic world. Whereas Star Trek, for all its fantasy, is much more realistic. There's a lot of subtlety. Sometimes the good guys do bad things, and then they have to figure that out. Sometimes they convince the bad guys to stop being bad guys. Over time, you see, enemies who are suddenly now allies, just like in the real world, right? Just like that's the way the world works, but it's sort of idealized in that it is much more egalitarian, hence the sort of Benetton crack, and everybody dresses alike. But it is a much richer world. And one of the reasons I thought about that is because for years, I'm a big sci-fi fan, and for years I watched Star Trek: The Next Generation, the reruns and all this. And I used to think Picard is actually a fantastic example of a leader. He's fantastic. He's the captain. Anything he says goes, and yet he brings in other voices. He doubts himself. He makes mistakes and apologizes, makes amends. all these things. He's a good leader. He tries to be as transparent as possible. He's in a military structure, and yet he's a transparent leader. He tells people, and sometimes he even practices radical transparency. He explains exactly what's going on in his internal workings. This is a great leader. This is a really great leader. Yoda, not so much. He's just a bossy little guy who tells you what to do and you're supposed to do it. And if you don't, well, whatever. It's just a very different paradigm. So I am very much in the Picard camp.
Wow. Well, I hope that we're not going to be boycotted by the Star Wars fans that are listening. But I have to say, I'm not much of a sci-fi fan, but I have been watching the latest version of the Picard. I think it was Netflix or something or other, and it was quite good. But I will definitely be watching that through completely different color spectacles next time I watch that. One of the directions of my self-awareness compass is listening, and inherent in that is communication. What are the 3 keys that you talk about to unlocking really effective communication?
Yeah, listening and communication they're part of the same. They're 2 parts of the same thing.
Yeah.
So Aristotle has 3 elements that go into rhetoric: pathos, ethos, and logos. I'm not going to go into that. It's a little bit obscure, especially in this day and age. But I look at 3 other elements that are related. One is, when you want to communicate, you need to have a message. You need to have something to say. That seems obvious, but think about all the people who talk and never really say anything.
Yeah.
Right. And that message has to have value. And that value is driven by your values. If you're a good person, right? If you have values, if you're a principled person, you behave with values, your message will have more meaning. I give the example of the boy who cried wolf, right? Little village, there's a shepherd boy on the hill with everyone's sheep. One day he gets bored, he screams, wolf, and everyone comes running because they think a wolf is attacking the sheep. They get there and he's laughing. He thinks it's funny. They're not too happy. Same thing happens the next day. Again, they're not happy. Third day, a wolf does show up. Well, guess what? The villagers don't see him as someone of value. They don't see him as someone who has values. They don't see his message as being valuable. He yells, wolf, and they stay down below in the village because they think he's lying. Yeah. That's a perfect example of a meaningless message and a valueless message. So you have to have a message that is meaningful, that is valuable, that people need to hear. Yeah. And you also need to have an audience. And that audience has to be somewhat known and somewhat receptive. Now, it's hard to control the audience, but you need to have someone you're speaking to who understands what you're saying and you understand where they're coming from. Part of that understanding where they're coming from is listening. You have to know, you want to listen to the audience as much as possible. Now, that's not always right now. I can't listen to the audience of this podcast, obviously, but I have a certain sense if somebody's listening to this podcast, they're coming from a particular point of view, and I can surmise what they're thinking. And what they're probably thinking is, I can't believe this guy dissed Yoda. But the thing about listening is it's not just listening with your ears, it's also observing people's behavior, right? If someone is not paying attention, you can tell. All right. So that is part of that audience building. And the third element is related to the other 2. And that is clarity. You need clarity. Often forgotten. Clarity trumps everything. It is the most important element because you can have the perfect message and the perfect willing audience, but if you're not clear, what's the point? You might as well just give up. And I'll give you an example of that. I use my poor wife as an example. We used to be part of a neighborhood association in the city of Baltimore, and we were very active leaders in that. And she would send out these text messages, and she was an attorney, and she would do them. She's a very busy person, so she would do them very quickly. And she would send out this gobbledygook. And I had to say to her, I'm sorry, I have no idea. I'm married to you, and I have no idea what you're trying to say here. This makes no sense at all. You just sent this out to 15 people, and they're all now scratching their heads. And she had a valuable message, and she had a receptive audience, but because she wasn't clear, it meant nothing. And eventually I convinced her that she needs to take 2 seconds and proofread her text message before she sends. And she started doing that and everything's okay. But that's a really, crude but obvious example of a lack of clarity. But we see that all the time. People shoot off. They think, I don't have time. So think about this. you're going to send a message by email or text or Slack or whatever, and you shoot it off quickly because you don't have time to compose it, right? You don't want to take the time to proofread it, look at it.
Yeah.
Other people are getting it. They're looking at it and going, I don't know what this means. So several things could happen. One is they could just ignore it, right? They devalue your message.
Yeah.
The other is they misinterpret it. Another one is they come back to you for clarification, or they go to someone else for clarification. None of these is exactly saving time, right? And by the time you get the whole thing worked out, how much time have you wasted? So in order to save 2 seconds, you wasted however much time or made massive mistakes. Yeah. Clarity is that important.
And it really does beg the question of how many times have we sent emails when we should have just left them in the drafts, done it and come back. And I think as leaders, that is really important, especially if you're sharing quite difficult messages, to make sure that you have that audience message and that clarity.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've touched on this a little. You say that every leadership problem is a teaching opportunity. And as I mentioned earlier, experience and experiential learning are elements of my self-awareness compass. So how can leaders really harness problems and make them into learning opportunities?
Yeah, actually, what I say is every leadership problem is a teaching problem, which is even more in depth. So yes, every leadership problem is a teaching opportunity, right? You can always learn from your challenges, right? There's always something to learn and there's something to be conveyed. But even more importantly, every leader is a teacher, must be a teacher. And every teacher is a leader. In fact, I have yet to find a difference in terms of what they do, how they do it, their approach, their attitude, their mindset between great leaders and great teachers. I have never found, the only difference I can find is title. Teachers usually don't have a leadership title. Otherwise, that's it. They're the same.
Do you think teachers are aware, or they really no, I can see.
No.
For those who are listening and not watching on YouTube, Jim is shaking his head.
No,
you know where I'm going with that question.
They do not. No, they are not aware, and that is a crying shame. I think it affects education. I think if teachers thought of themselves as leaders, they could be better teachers if they really thought of that in depth, and vice versa. If leaders thought of themselves as teachers, they'd be better leaders. I one time was working as a consultant at a small school, and I did a presentation with a bunch of administrators. All of them had previously been teachers. And I asked them, I gave them a prompt. I forget exactly what I asked them, but it was a prompt to get them to write about the qualities of a great teacher. And then I separately had them work on the qualities of a great leader. And we started listing them. And as we were listing them, in the middle of it, they suddenly said, oh my God, they're exactly the same. Yeah. They were exactly the same. And so I think that awareness among teachers is critical. Because when you think of yourself as a leader, it gives you a different perspective on teaching. You're not just pushing content, right? That's not a good teacher, right? That kind of a teacher is not a leader. Somebody just stands in front of a room and lectures is not a good teacher, and they're not a good leader. But someone who actually brings out the best in students. One of my favorite definitions of leadership is from Dwight Eisenhower. And he said that what a leader does is a leader gets other people to do what needs to be done because they want to do it. Well, that's exactly what teachers do. They get students to learn because they want to learn, not because they have to.
I think that description is very helpful, that teachers are leaders and leaders are teachers. And I think you're right. I don't think we think of ourselves as leaders, teachers, and leaders, but maybe that would really help us think about the impact that we have on children, those we work with. And interestingly, at the end of June, I will be gifting my books to my old school because my teachers made such an impression on me. So my history teacher, my English teacher, neither of whom are still with us, sadly, but I'm gifting my book as a way of saying, thank you for starting me on the journey to appreciate writing, to appreciate English, and my history teacher who taught me how to write essays. And really, that's how it started for me. So you're right, there was such leadership there, that I never recognized. And now looking back, I think you're right. Teaching, leading and teaching.
That's wonderful.
What topics are emerging for you in the leadership space? What has got you interested, and what do you think you're going to be writing about in the next 12 months, 18 months? What's out there for you?
Yeah, self-awareness is becoming bigger in the leadership space, or it's returning maybe. I think that's really key. So that idea that you know who you are, how you behave, why you behave those ways, and how to improve. I think that self-improvement is critical as well. I'll be honest with you, Nia, I'm not real thrilled with the leadership space. I'm a little bit cynical about it. I think a lot of it is, people they're saying good things. I don't disagree with them, but I'm thinking if I'm a leader, I'm in a management position, and I'm reading this, how do I make this work? Right. And some of it's hyper practical. Do this, do that, do the next thing. Right. And that's not really how the world works. And some of it is this sort of pie in the sky, vague, be a certain way. And if you're not that way, how do you become that way? And I think that's what we need to see more of. And that's what I'm always trying to get at. That's why I focus on that negative paradigm so much, looking at bad behavior and trying to figure out, well, what's a different way of doing this? Because that's how we actually experience the world. We don't experience the world through lessons. We experience the world through mistakes, right? The correction of things. That's how we really approach the world. If everything's going great, you don't really notice, right? If every day is sunshine and lollipops, well, every day is sunshine and lollipops. But when it rains all of a sudden, you notice that, right?
True.
And so and if it rains every day, you're miserable, right? So I don't like to dwell on the negative, but I think there's so many lessons that we can derive from what goes wrong rather than what goes right. So rather than look at the top this and the top that's one of the reasons I like your podcast, because you often interview people who aren't like, some highfalutin, big name person. You're interviewing real leaders in real leadership positions, applying it day to day. That's very practical. That's very good. When you read, you think of a book like Good to Great, famous book, everybody's read it. It's a good book, has a lot of great lessons in it, but it's derived from all these CEOs, some of whom went on to fail. Most of those businesses are out of business. That he was focused, so it's not the world isn't just all these top people. A lot of the people in the middle echelon also have a lot of great wisdom, and that's where I look to for leadership wisdom.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because that is something that's really important to me. It's about people who talk the talk and walk the walk. So I'm really interested in speaking to more people who are in the leadership space within their organization, within their company, who can talk to me about what it's really like to be leading in their organization. Because you're right, you have top tips to do this, but actually in the real world, I can only do two of those things, because the rest of them don't really suit my organization. So yes, most definitely, I'm interested in having that conversation about what it really feels like to be a leader. And that's something that I'm very interested in. And I describe myself as, what I do is a director of a children's charity, and how I do it is self-aware leadership. And I really want to maintain that practical experience, that hands-on leadership, so that I can talk about it rather than commentating on it from a distance. And so that's a really interesting element of our conversation. Jim, thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm going to continue reading what you write on Substack and looking forward to doing that. As I've said, listeners and watchers, we will make sure that there are links in the show notes so that you can do the same. But for now, Jim, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Nia. This has been wonderful.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode, where we aim to develop self-aware leaders around the globe to generate kinder, more respectful and creative working relationships through reflection, recognition and regulation. Head over to my website at knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk to sign up to my newsletter to keep up to date with my blog, podcast and book. Looking forward to having you on my learning journey.